We've been talking about love over the last few weeks, and we're going to continue that story. And one of the things that is closely tied to love in the biblical story is justice or injustice. And I want to do a short little mini series on justice and love as we think through some of these topics. It's easy to read some grandiose, giant, problematic thing that society has done. And basically what happened is that he was black, living in Alabama, and was accused by a white woman who he was, what's our age here? So let me modify that just briefly here. Anyway, so he was accused by a white woman for this crime that he hadn't actually committed, and the justice system was so honed in on him and the problem that he had created and the problem that he was in society that it didn't matter if he had done it. It didn't matter if their sources or their evidence were weak. It didn't matter what the real story was. It mattered that they caught someone, that they put that person behind bars, and that the community felt safer because they had done that. And it had no difference at all that he hadn't actually done it, which was so plainly evident to everyone involved or around or even looking at half of the facts. Today's text, not day 7 that was up. I don't actually have today's up, but I want to read it to you. It comes from Amos, and the thing is that so often these things are so closely connected that we often just sort of set it aside. But the text, chapter 5, verse 14 of Amos, seek good and not evil, that you may live, and so the Lord, the God of hosts, will be with you. I like how the Message puts it. The Message is like, you know how you call God your best friend? Well, if you live like God is your best friend, you might actually have God as your best friend. It's a little bit like a nice little jab there. Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate or in the city, or for us it would be in the courtrooms. At the gate is where they held public court in this time period, and so you have it at the front gate. Anyway, tied to doing good, tied to the love of God, tied to the actions that we're supposed to have, is this understanding that justice is at the core of society, at the core of community, at the core of who we are and what we're doing. And when we understand that justice, when we see the injustice and understand the impact that it has on life, we sit alone in restaurants and just cry, seeing the life that someone has had to live because of our injustices, our societal problems that are intrinsic in the way we live and do life. Throughout the prophets, which I talk about a lot because I absolutely love the prophets. So what happens is, let's just do a short little backstory here. What happens is you have Genesis and the story of Abraham and Abraham's family, and then at some point the Hebrew people get sucked into the Egypt story and the Exodus, and God rescues them, and they move into their own land and their own space, and they demand a king because everyone else has a king. Why wouldn't we have a king? Kings make everything great. Even if, never mind, sorry. Sometimes I get sidetracked on American politics, and we just got our permanent residency, and so now I can stop talking about American politics. And it's everyone else has a king. We want a king. Kings make everything better. We're going to be affluent and wealthy, and the world is going to be right and made perfect because we have a king. And God's like, I'm your king, but if you really want a king, here. And God gives them a king. And what follows is injustice after injustice, taking advantage of people and groups of people and foreigners and anyone they can to make that affluent society work. We're still doing that today. We just don't have kings to do it for us. We have, again, never mind. So the prophets come in, and one by one, God sends people that are willing to speak truth to these kings. You have two kinds of prophets. Lots of kings have prophets on their payroll. You can imagine it might be difficult to be paid by the king or the president and give the king truth about what they should be doing and how they should be treating people justly, right? You can imagine that if your livelihood depends on how you report information to the king, you might be biased in what information you give him, right? And that's exactly what happens. But every once in a while, we have a prophet that is willing to risk their life, their livelihood, and put themselves on the line to speak truth to those injustices that are being done. Second kind of prophet, the one that lives in the world, sees the world, understands the world, looks at the kingdom and sees massive injustices happening in the community and says, we have to do something about that. And each time God sends a prophet, they come in and they tell Israel all of the problems, or Judah, all of the problems that they are facing. They are taking advantage of the poor. They are taking advantage of a particular group of people. They are taking advantage of foreigners. They constantly are tearing people down to lift others up. This is a human problem. This is not an Israel problem. This is still a problem. And there in Alabama, I think it was don't remember exactly. This gentleman was faced with the problem of injustice, and nobody was there to speak truth to that power. Well, you kind of needed a white male to speak truth to that power, but that's a side story. Nobody was there to speak truth to that power that needed to be. And so over time, actually, he is set free because of a lawyer that decides to invest in his life. A lawyer that decides that he's going to spend every waking moment to visit him in prison, to spend time with him, to appeal to the courts over and over and over and over, until finally he's set free, he's reunited with his family, who has now been separated for so many years that has serious relational problems and long-term damage done to this family because of what has happened. That is the tie of love and justice. Just to be on the safe side, we're going to look at a couple of more stories, but those prophets are there to undo those strands of injustices, to look at the world, see it for what it is, and speak up and speak out. That's part of our call to live in community. It's part of our understanding of God's love to be in that moment, to see the truth, and to speak that truth. That's part of what it means to love God and love others, is to love justice. Now, we sometimes have a skewed understanding of what justice means. Or just not really an understanding at all, might be the better term. I was sitting in this same conference and asking the question, we're talking about, well, what is justice? What is the justice system supposed to do? Do you have an answer? Help me out here. What is the justice system supposed to do? Just throw it out, whatever you think. Make things right. Okay. And how are we doing that? Yeah. The thing is, we don't really know. We think if we create a consequence that it will deter someone from following through with an act. But we don't know we don't know if that needs to be a punishment, like you've done this and so now you're going to be punished, or if we're like pulling them out of society to protect them, to protect society, right? Or if we're trying to rehabilitate someone, okay, these are actions you've done, and we need to make sure you don't do these actions again. So we're going to put you in a place to give you a chance to learn right. We don't know what it means to make things right. We don't know how to do that. And so sometimes prison sentences get longer and longer and longer because we think, well, we're just going to make this punishment so great that no one can bear it. I was reading Malcolm Gladwell a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling the story of a dad. This is a dark message. Anyway, he's telling the story of a dad who lost his daughter in a fluke crime, goes and champions in California the 3-strike law. You familiar with the 3-strike law? Basically, regardless of what you've done, strike 1 is a certain sentence. It's a normal sentence. Strike 2 increases that same sentence. And strike 3, if it's federal, is life in prison. And so you have what they've determined is this saying, okay, if you're a repeat offender, you need to be put away forever. And it has just ballooned the criminal justice system with the prisons, with huge numbers of people, sometimes whose third strike is both nonviolent and really not at all related to the sentence that they're in. Second story, same idea. Family lost their daughter in a senseless crime, chooses forgiveness over trying to figure out what does punishment and justice look like, and chooses to learn how to love and forgive and push through all of that, literally faces the criminal in court, and still manages to figure out how to move beyond that. And what could have been the same situation, she could have gone from, the mother could have had the publicity she needed to take control, to have that power, and to go and use it to, this was in Alberta, it could have created that media storm that creates 3-strike laws, and chose love and forgiveness instead. We have a duty to understand what love and justice have to do with each other. We have a duty to understand where are we supposed to be when God calls us to love. It's not just the friendly gesture, although it is. It's not just taking meals to someone that's hungry. It's not just when someone's in need. It is also standing up and creating or speaking truth to those injustices. Curtis actually referenced this text when he was doing communion. This was one of our texts a few days ago. Jesus is speaking to some Pharisees, and he says, "You tithe mint and rue and herbs and of all kinds, yet neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others." He's saying, look, you've gotten caught up in all of the religiousness of what you're supposed to be doing. But the two things, what does he say? The two core things that you're missing out on? Justice and love, because they're so deeply tied in faith in God. They're so deeply tied that justice comes with love. Correcting injustices come with love. So the next day, okay, after crying myself through dinner, the next day we sat in a room with a man named, it was about 10 of us, with a man named Anthony Ray Hinton. Anthony was in 1985 in Alabama. This is not to highlight Alabama. This is just highlighting injustices. In 1985, there was a couple of robberies that included death. And he was identified by a woman as being at the scene of another robbery. He didn't have the money to defend himself, so he gets a court-appointed lawyer. And the court-appointed lawyer didn't have the resources to pay for a forensics expert. The only thing that was linked to Anthony during the trial was a bullet that forensic expert for the state said matched the gun that belonged to his mother. There's no fingerprints, there's no indication that he used it or had it or anything, but they said the bullet matches the gun. I kid you not. This is almost humorous if it wasn't so sad. I kid you not. The forensic expert that he was able to get for Anthony was blind in one eye and admitted on the stand that he had a hard time working with the microscope. That's the forensics expert the state was able to provide for him to defend himself in this case. He spent 30 years. Okay, that's the totality of the case. That's it. He spent 30 years on death row in Alabama state prisons. And he's sitting in this room, and he begins his story. He says, I spent nearly 30 years on death row. And for 30 years, I didn't see a pastor or a minister or a priest. Injustice is deeply tied to the love of God. And here in the darkest place of his life, there was not a single person, not a chaplain, not a pastor, not a minister. There was not a single person to come and represent the love of God for Anthony. That's an indictment on Christianity, on Christians, on what it means to love others. So here I was again, not alone this time. Tears running down our faces, trying to understand the deep injustices done. Appeal after appeal, the state wouldn't help. Eventually, they grant an appeal process, and conveniently they can't find the bullet to examine it again. When they do, forensics experts look at it, plainly seeing that it doesn't match, and don't even retry him. So he walks out of prison. There's no apology from the state. There's no, oh, this was bad. There's no correction of any kind. These are injustices in our communities, in our world, that, quite frankly, is the call of the church to follow and to listen, to stand up, to speak out, to offer that love. So we're moving in, and if you haven't already seen where I'm headed, we're moving into Matthew 25, where Jesus is trying to express to people what it means to love and act. So I'm just going to pull it up here. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at the left. And the king will say to those at his right, "Come, you that are blessed, my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for me, foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me some food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me." And they're going to say, "When did that happen?" And he's going to respond, "Whatever you have done for the least of these, you have done for me." He's going to respond that every time you've seen an injustice and worked to undo it, every time you've seen someone hurting and you've worked to offer aid, you have done this for me. The love of God, the call for Christians to be love in our world is deeply tied to this understanding of justice, this understanding of injustice. Matthew 25 actually takes that one step further, because there is no statement about whether or not that person in prison had done it or not. Anthony Hinton tells the story of stepping into that trial and his own lawyer saying to him, "Yeah, every black man says they didn't do anything. We have an obligation, and it's not always that painfully obvious. We have an obligation to understand the link between God's love and injustice, and to do what we can to undo that injustice. Do what we can to bring forth justice in the world." Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.